Nyedis Breachcast, the world's first identity management app made exclusively for identity experts and product owners, is available in the iOS App Store now.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our panel today. We're going to be talking with some friends from Nyedis about real-world IAM architecture teardowns. I'll be your host throughout the course of the panel today. I'm Mark Callahan. I'm on the product marketing team here at Strata, joined by Granville Schmidt, who is the chief architect here at Strata, and I mentioned our friend Adam Callahan, who is the CIO and co-founder at Nyedis. Today's topic is one of IAM architecture teardowns. And as we think about this, I'm sure some of y'all in the audience are going, all right, what direction are we going to take this? We've at Strata, we obviously talk about ourselves as the identity orchestration company. And there's one thing that we don't give a lot of airtime to, and we really should. And that's the idea of an orchestrator as a unit of being in a piece of software, and what we do, not just what it enables, but what you're able to do with that. And so I'd love to dig into the panel today with you, Adam and Granville, as we talk about, what is kind of broken with identity environments today. I love the video you put together, Adam, ahead of this, where you talked about being just such a fan of orchestration. But when you introduce the idea of orchestration, you're actually re-architecting everything. It's a new approach to a degree, and I don't want. I'll soften that. But what thoughts?
Yeah, I don't want to say we're re-architecting because that seems a bit drastic. Because it's not necessarily that we're not going in just saying we got to redo everything. It's more about there's a new layer to the identity stack. So normally you have your provisioning, you have your access management, you have federation, you have directory. Well, now there's a new one, and that's orchestration. That's a whole new part of the identity stack in my mind that should be part of the entire fabric that you're installing in your enterprise. So it's not necessarily a complete re-architecture as much as it's inserting this orchestration layer and then just kind of repointing certain pieces to route through it for much greater flexibility and massive costs and time savings for future implementations, rip and replacements that you might have to do. I mean, we all know companies, so you get a new CIO, all of a sudden we're now going Microsoft. Okay, now we're all going Ping. Now we're all going whatever. And those rip and replace take so much time. And when you have an orchestration layer in place, that time is almost non-existent. So it's a huge savings in my opinion. So that's why I'm a big proponent, because it just makes a massively greater flexibility for your whole identity infrastructure. And then you can plug in other stuff like MFA and all kinds of other threat metrics type things you want to do, verification, whatever. And that's why I love it, is it allows much greater flexibility, and it greatly diminishes cost and time for any type of a migration or rip and replace that any type of company would ever want to do.
I love it. Granville, you and I forget if it was Ian Glazier or if it was Simon Moffat. Someone had written an article, and they just had written about the fact that as you think about identity infrastructure, the decisions that are made at the strategic level often involve changes that are expected to be made in 1 to 3 years. But reality is that identity infrastructure is typically like a 5 to 8 year, if not a 10-year embedded thing, because it's so hard. It's so hard to move. It's inflexible. What we're suggesting is a new degree of flexibility. And I mean, you mentioned the word fabric, Adam. We talk about identity fabrics. Granville, what are your thoughts about, moving to this orchestrated architecture?
Well, I'm kind of biased, but I love it. But one thing I like to do is like taking a step back. So like oftentimes most companies don't fully understand like how embedded identity is into their system. Oftentimes they actually understand a little bit more like how embedded they are with certain other technologies to make those applications work. For instance, you might have an application that is directly tied to a particular database. You might have an application that's directly tied to a particular cloud. And if you look about the evolution over the years, we start creating more and more abstraction layers for applications. Like you might take an application, you might containerize it, potentially run it on Kubernetes, and then you achieve what's known as like cloud native, meaning like you could take it across clouds, take it on premises based on your business needs. Now, identity orchestration is just the same abstraction, right? Except instead of just being this infrastructure piece that provides like, storage management or a place to run your applications, now you're creating this fabric around your application, allowing it to tie into all these critical systems. Thus, you're able to take advantage of more modern identity without having to re-architect these applications. And so I'm a big fan of it for lots of other reasons we're about to discuss.
Well, and you talked about re-architecting, the applications themselves. And, I think that's one of the biggest hurdles that, Adam, as you're consulting with organizations and they're looking at, hey, I've been working with SiteMinder or Ping or whoever it is for years and years and years at ForgeRock, you name it. The amount of effort it took to get up that hill and getting all those applications over all that period to work with that provider was heavy as heck, right? That was a monumental lift.
Yeah, that's where the biggest cost is the backend apps and hooking them all up to that identity system, the access system. Yeah,
that's it. And I think, I think what we're excited to talk about, and why we're getting together today and just on this panel is the idea that huge lift that people went up, getting up to the top of the mountain, to be able to move to another IDP or to add those other services. There's this impression that you might have to do the same amount down and back up again to get the applications working with those services, and do it over again and over again as you're thinking about the additional services. And as we talk about this fabric, this identity fabric, there's a shortcut. There's a place where we're not actually even refactoring the apps.
Yeah, you guys are like the lift and shift wormhole. It's like you're just instantly there. You just come out the other side, you're already done.
That's awesome. It's that trick where it's like, what's the shortest point between two dots on a piece of paper? And then like the teacher folds it in half and pokes through it and your mind just melts.
Right.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
That's kind of like, we were speaking earlier about, there was that guy where someone's like, oh, we have like 400 applications. We need to move everything over. Let's just move them all in a weekend. And then everyone laughs and laughs and laughs. And it's like, but we took that as like well, what if we could? And that's kind of what we do at Nyedis is we'd like to take the impossible and try and figure out how to do it. And we did. So using Strata, we were able to take an example proof of concept that's using just ping fed, which would be any type of a SAML-based access tool, where everyone has all their apps tied directly to the IDP for authentication. And then the biggest problem, like with that client we were talking about before, was that now I got to go to every single app. I have to work with every app team, route it through, change, the SAML stuff, get the new certs, point to the new place, go through dev, QA, testing, production, make sure it works. Oops, go back, start over, and do that times 400. And that's the biggest fear that everyone has. So when we were able to prove out using Strata Mavericks that we can take all those SAML applications and literally in a weekend make one change in a half hour and have them all flipped over and no backend apps even have to do anything, that's to me the magic. That's that wormhole. That's the wormhole, production.
I didn't have my prop ready, but now I do. It's that dot on a piece of paper and you shove the pencil through it. That's what we're doing.
So we're taking that 1.5 year timeline and shortening it to a weekend.
Well, so as we think about doing that in a weekend, you talk about Mavericks being the center of that. I'd love to ask you both a little bit about, the power of an orchestrator. So I mentioned at the opening of the panel is that from a marketing perspective, we actually don't give as much airtime to what an orchestrator actually is as opposed to what it does. And I'd love to just run that by both of you. Obviously, Adam, you've worked with us for quite some time and are very familiar with it. But Granville, from maybe like an internal perspective, what do you see as like the power of an orchestrator itself? Like, how would you describe the orchestrator and the power of it?
Man, I love this question. I like to think of the orchestrator as like this polymorphic thing, meaning like you can take it and shape it to your business needs, which can be like, it can serve like many different purposes. For instance, you could have like legacy applications that require certain types of headers. So the orchestrator can act as an identity-aware proxy, authenticate against whatever modern IDP that you have or modern IDPs that you have, enforce certain policies like MFA or certain types of access control, and then be able to provide that application the necessary like data it needs in a header to allow that application to understand who the end user is and do its own level of authorization internally. So it can act as an identity-aware proxy, but it can also act as so many other things, such as it can also be an OIDC provider. And what we mean by that is, while we're not an IDP, our orchestrator can be seen as an IDP for these applications. So by just enabling a few different switches, your applications can point to the orchestrator. The orchestrator is then configured with your IDPs, such as Okta, Intra-ID, Ping Identity, and it's able to route those OIDC requests appropriately to those IDPs, but your applications are pointed at us. And the benefit there is obviously like you can actually go from one IDP to another. You can enforce like continuity. You can provide generalized MFA and policy across all of your IDPs without having to manage the different policies in each one of them and keep them synchronized. But it can also do this really cool thing, which I think is like, I don't know, it makes my mind explode thinking about it sometimes. I'm going to actually need to share my screen if it's okay.
Please.
Yeah. So when we think about like super legacy applications, like whether it's like 10 or 20 years old, sometimes older, you might have applications that are directly tied to legacy directory services, like whether that's like an on-premises Active Directory or a different directory server. Those applications will do like LDAP communication to authenticate an end user. So it might do like an LDAP bind and use the appropriate authentication method that application needs, whether it's like simple or using things like SASL and Spinego and NTLM or Kerberos. But that's all like back channel. So these applications are tied directly to these directory servers. And so it's really hard without having to rewrite those applications to be able to say, hey, we want them to use like a modern cloud IDP that may not support that, right? Or may not support the version of the protocol that this application is hard coded to. And so we can do this really cool thing where on the backside, we can be an LDAP provider acting like a directory server. And so that we answer the requests coming from that application and return the data that they require to run. But on the front side of that application, like if it's a web application, we can also act as an identity-aware proxy. So when an end user tries to access that application, we can actually intercept that traffic, stop that user from seeing the legacy login form, send them over to say Entra ID, Ping Identity, Okta, your IDP of choice. Allow them to authenticate. And then when they hit the application, we will go through the authorization logic, and then we'll provide that application what it needs just in time so that on the backside of that request from the end user, when the application makes a back channel request to a directory server, we're able to answer that request using the data that we got from the IDP. And so I like to think about it as like the sandwich, right?
I was about to ask you gave us a hamburger. So bring us back to our hamburger here. Yes.
Yeah. So I like to think about it as like squishing an application between orchestrators. So you have like an application on the front side, or in this example, the top side, which is an orchestrator acting as an identity-aware proxy. But on the back side, it's acting as a LDAP provider. Because like end user requests don't go directly to LDAP, they go to the application. And the application does these back channel requests in its own time to fulfill, like, say, a login request. And so if you think about it as squishing the application, it shows the power here of what orchestrators can do.
Yeah.
And it doesn't just have to be as simple as this. The topology here can be even more complex for even more complex enterprise applications.
I dig it. Well, Adam, please
talk about how lightweight those orchestrators.
I was just about to ask, because this sounds
like, oh man, I have to set up all this infrastructure.
This is like a juicy double. It's like massive, and it's going to take all these things, and it's just getting heavier and heavier. Yeah. Adam, tell us. Yeah.
So, well, the way I can tell our clients about it is everyone's familiar with like an Apache reverse proxy. We use them everywhere, especially in the authentication space, right? Because that's where we're going to front end all our apps so they're not exposed. So the Apache reverse proxy, super simple to use. There's the one file that you can go in and you can just make changes right in that file, and it tells where to route the request. It's developer's dream. There's so simple, very lightweight. It does what it's supposed to do, and then just gets out of the way. The orchestrator is pretty much the exact same thing as how I see it. It's extremely lightweight that gets installed on there. It can also be run in containers too, but it acts as a reverse proxy. It grabs all the traffic, it intercepts it, and there's a file that you can edit that basically says the flow. And this is my favorite part about this, because I can throw that file into GitHub. I can change control the whole thing. It's super easy for me to see it and maintain it. I can change it between orchestrators in different environments, whatever. But when it hits, it says, okay, I'm trying to access this application. What do I do? Okay, well, I'm going to authenticate with IDP1, Entra. And then once that's done, I'm going to use MFA Duo. Now, if I'm going to application 2, I can say, well, actually, for this one, that's my SIAM app. So actually, I want people to authenticate with PingFed. And then I'm going to use MFA. We're actually going to use AWS, some custom Lambda SNS thing that we're going to do. And you can go as fine grain as individual applications. Like you can say, like, not just this app, but in this app with this path for this one specific image, we're going to have a completely different authentication scheme that's tied to it. And you do it all centrally within this one file. And you can put custom logic in there. That's the real open-ended thing. Is it's like it has all this built in, but at one point you're like, you know what? I really wanted to make this webhook call out to this other thing. You can do it whatever you want, which makes it massively flexible, lightweight, scales horizontally as far as you could possibly need it, on-prem, in the cloud, as a Docker. I mean, it's my favorite.
I love hearing that. Well, and as we think about that, like contingency on the cloud, Granville, just, as we think about the architecture, there's the orchestrator as on its own. And then, we do have a UI that allows for configuration. I know that, Adam, you've done custom stuff outside of the UI as well. But as we think about that, there's no dependencies between those two. Is that right, Granville?
That's correct. Yeah. So if you want, you can follow the single config file approach that Adam is talking about. You could also configure it all via the UI. So maybe instead of like handwriting it, you can utilize our UI that's able to generate out the corresponding config for you, which then allows it to store it into a location of your choice. It could be like a block storage thing, such as like Amazon S3, for example. And then the orchestrator can reference that to get its latest updates for the config and reload. So no reliance there. The UI does make life simple for people that like to operate in the UI.
Depending on the user, right, mm-hmm. on who's interacting with it. So no special skills needed. Maybe even a marketing guy could do it, but yeah, I digress.
And you can definitely plug this into your CI/CD pipeline, like Chef Puppet, all that kind of fun stuff. TeamCity builds. You can have this all part of your entire infrastructure workflow, so that you can be completely hands off for production deployments for any changes or initial deployments as well, even.
Well, I'd love to ask a question then. So, as we set out the agenda for today, we talked about, why an orchestrated environment is so important. And we talked about the flexibility that people are getting out of this, and the ability to create their own identity fabric with both the services they have now and the ones they intend to add. Another thing I'd love to just get your take on, Adam, is, there's certainly orchestrators as a language or identity orchestration. There's been a lot of talk in the market, and obviously there's, options that people have. And I'd love to get your take, having worked with both these products. If you're a Ping customer who's in a SIAM scenario and you're planning to stay with Ping for a long time, something like DaVinci may be a good option for that user. But if you're looking at like a best of breed, want to switch vendors, you want to look at multiple IDPs, you want to have all this additional flexibility, I'd love to get your take, how the two compare.
Sure. So we've worked with both, obviously, and they're both identity orchestrators, and but they do have a little bit of differences, right? So on the Ping side, it's completely SaaS based, so it's all in the cloud, which some clients prefer that. They're very cloud first. They don't want anything running locally at all. They want to route everything through the cloud. And that's kind of Ping's approach, right? Because when they acquired ForgeRock, they said, hey, look, all that ForgeRock stuff, that's going to be our on-prem stuff. All our Ping stuff will be our cloud stuff. And they really took that approach for the DaVinci side. So it's very cloud friendly. And so for those that are cloud first, that's a really good plus point for them. They do have just an astronomical amount of connectors that will connect into pretty much everything. I mean, they did put a lot of time and effort into building out just a massive library. And then they have the UI flow, which lets you build a custom UI for like custom login pages and stuff. But that's where I start to have my own personal hangups, because it's not as intuitive as they want it to believe. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people then jump on there and be like, oh, we're going to do the whole UI in this. And I don't think that's really the best thing. I think it's kind of like, to me, it's still kind of gimmicky at this point. It's not good enough. I think they should do it externally. So it's like there's definitely pros and cons. But for me, I still love the fact that I can just pull this thing on-prem with that single file. Like that, to me, is just, it's so much better from my standpoint as a developer and an engineer that has to work with the stuff on a day-to-day basis. Because like I don't want to learn how to do their custom language, or I don't want to learn how to do it their way. It's like I just want to be able to just, I know how to write YAML, I know how to write JSON, I can write the language, I can just plop it in there and go. It's a little bit easier. But yeah, there's definitely pros and cons on both sides. But for me personally, what I choose and what I recommend, it's always been Strata pretty much in the orchestration space.
Well, and I think you bring something up. We actually, Granville and I participated in a couple of Department of Defense conferences that actually were recently happened, and also a Black Hat event. And one of the key things in describing that was that, as we think about DaVinci being SaaS and us having this air-gapped architecture, is the Mavericks orchestrator can work anywhere. Granville, you joke about it being on a spaceship or a submarine. There is no connection required, and that's actually critical as you start thinking about disconnected mode operations, as you need to be.
Well, think about cruise ships, like something a little more realistic, right? I mean, you have cruise ships, their entire cities floating out there in the middle of nowhere, and they may not have internet. Like they might not have Starlink yet. I don't know, but they're going to want something like they have an entire data center in those ships, and everything has to run on-prem. So if they want to throw in orchestration, it's pretty much going to have to be something that can go on-prem.
Captain Schmidt, what do you think about that?
Man, I love this. I mean, we've had our conversations with a lot of different cruise ship companies, but man, there's some of the pain points that you hear are different than you'd expect, right? Like, or maybe you expect. People imagine being out at sea, the city in the water, as you just described, Adam, but unable to make reservations for dinner, right?
Definitely.
Or unable to, hey, maybe I want to change my excursion I'm going to do tomorrow, and I'm unable to do so. And now I'm missed out on this other opportunity after meeting some new friends on the ship, right? Like you have some very dissatisfied people. And then you have the extreme end of this where, hey, you have crew members unable to log into critical systems that they need to operate the vessel, right? And that's unacceptable. And I think this is a really cool opportunity for Strata to be able to really solve some of these critical challenges for these scenarios or companies that have these intermittent disconnections from the internet.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, as we're thinking about this, so it kind of takes us into a conversation about use cases, and I'd love to come back to the continuity conversation in just a moment here, or that disconnected mode. Adam, Granville, leave it to either of you. One of the really common use cases that we get, we talked about taking that piece of paper and folding it in half. What's the fastest path between point A and point B? Is I want to go from this IDP to another IDP. I'm at this place where I've outgrown SiteMinder, or I want to move off of a highly federated, really just ingrained environment like PingFed, and I want to get to a cloud-hosted environment, say Microsoft Entra ID. The orchestrator makes a great solution for making that migration path, does it not?
Yes. And with a little bit of hackery, you can, like I was saying, do that whole wormhole that we can flip where we can actually change it with literally just a DNS change is really the magic switch in the end. But obviously there's configuration we got to do ahead of time. But with just a DNS change, all of a sudden, all those apps that were going to whatever for that IDP, they're just now being routed to the Identity Orchestrator. And that orchestrator will then say, okay, for this application that's coming in, what's the IDP for it? And you can still use the old one. Like if you want to fail over softly, that's totally fine. But you can interject that identity fabric in the middle, and now you have this orchestration layer. And now you can slowly move our apps one at a time. You can test them all out, but you can do it centrally. The apps don't have to do anything. Like you, as the owner of the orchestrator, you can just change your policies to fit into the orchestrator and test them one at a time and move them over yourself. So now you don't even have to talk to these backend app teams. You can script a lot of it because you're using the same policies for a majority of the applications. So you can just copy and paste the majority of that. And it's super simple. We've built out, like I said, we built out the proof of concept.
I'd love to see.
I'll show you. Yeah, I guess. I just happen to have something. Hold on.
It just is here. Through the magic of the internet and the videos, yes, we have something lined up.
Okay, cool. So this is just a real quick demo. So we have a WordPress app that's just being currently fronted with PingFed.
Okay.
So what we're going to do is just log in with PingFed. You're going to see the PingFed login page, and it's pretty much what you would expect. This is an SP-initiated login, right? So I'm at WordPress. I go here. Now I'm seeing the PingFed login screen, all default out-of-the-box stuff. So we're going to go ahead and log in with a PingFed user, and as you would expect, yay, I'm logged in. The SAML assertion goes back and forth, and now I'm logged into WordPress. So now what we're going to do is we're using AWS here for this demo lab. So we're just going to go into the load balancer, and we're just changing the target group. So we're just going to change the routing to go from ping fed to the identity orchestrator. So the WordPress app is pointing to, let's just say idp.mycompany.com, right? So now all we're doing is changing where that's going to go. So now it's pointing to the Strata Nyedis orchestrator. So now when we click the login with ping fed button, I mean, we didn't change the UI, you're actually being routed to the orchestrator, which is saying, well, now I want you to log in with AWS Cognito. So this is where any IDP can be. It can be Microsoft Entra, it could be Cognito, it can still be ping fed, it could be Okta, it could be any IDP, whatever you want to do. Yeah. Now we log in, and ta-da, we're back into WordPress. We had to change nothing on the SP side. The application just works. All we had to do was our production go live was just that, changing the target group on the load balancer, and now every backend app is now using the orchestration layer.
That's awesome. And I think one of the things that you touched on that's probably resonating with our audience is the amount of time it takes politically to have those conversations with the app teams. If you're trying to make these changes happen, like that's the biggest time suck that people are facing. And what we're showing here is if you don't have to make changes to the app, you're taking this huge time element out of the equation. Yeah.
You don't have to talk to them. They don't even have to know what you're doing.
I'm loving orchestrators more and more. This is great. They really are cool, right? And so we promised the conversation was going to go one of why an orchestrated environment, that it's, what the power of the orchestrator is. We talked about a couple of use cases, but it's definitely not just I'm going to put an orchestrator in place to make this migration from, say, ping fed to Microsoft Entra ID. There's ongoing value of staying in the mix. And Granville, you talked about some of those other use cases. What else would I do then right after I've done migration?
Oh man. Okay. Sorry, I'm going to nerd out so hardcore right now. So one of the, if you think about these applications that have identity embedded in them today, right? Imagine that not only are they potentially running outdated protocols, but imagine that, hey, there's new security vulnerabilities that were discovered in those protocols. Now, if you have 4,000 applications, you have to go update 4,000 applications, right? And one of the coolest benefits from Strata is, look, we look out for these CVEs. We test our own software, we test the protocols themselves. And if we find something, we patch it. Right. And so not only can we patch like core protocol flaws, we can also allow all of your applications to take advantage of like really cool new technologies such as CAPE, the continuous access evaluation protocol, allowing things like, hey, maybe you want to have session revocation across all of your applications at a click of a button. That is only possible with the orchestrator in the mix, unless you want to go code this new protocol into 4,000 applications.
And talk to 4,000 app owners along the way, which is just, I mean, back to the mountain, right? They remember what it took. I mean, there may not be people still in the company who remember what it took to get up that monumental hill. And that's another problem, is that nobody knows who has the car keys anymore or the schematics. It's kind of like, we've got this mess up here. Nobody touch it because it works.
Right.
And so they're afraid to do anything else, but we're saying, cool, don't touch it. Sorry, keep going.
No. And imagine you do decide to climb that hill, right? Like maybe you're like, hey, maybe identity orchestration isn't for me yet. And then tomorrow something happens, right? So maybe you climb that hill, you updated all your applications, and the very next day you have to do it again, right? So it is this treadmill of like constant updates that you're going to have to keep up to date on. And I don't think that's feasible, right? Like you're not in the business of updating your applications. You're in the business of providing value to your customers. Those applications provide a certain value, and it is your responsibility as a business to ensure the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of that data. And I don't know, it's hard for me to imagine, after having so many conversations with so many large enterprises, how they could do it any other way. No one has the staffing to be able to spend all of their time updating applications 24/7.
I gotcha. Well, Adam, you work with our shared customers all the time. You get to see the minds and faces melting a little bit along the way. I mean, it's got to be cool to be able to show this magic path.
Yeah, and it's really just as a professional services consultancy, when people say, hey, we have this huge problem, or hey, we want to do this really custom use case, and everyone's telling us we can't do it. That's our primary focus. Like that's where we come in and say, okay, well, we'll figure it out. And a lot of times Strata Identity Orchestrator, that provides us that kind of magic toolbox to do whatever we want to do. Like we have a client where they want to have impersonation, where a manager can log in and impersonate another user through a completely different IDP without actually knowing their credentials, but just assume their credentials within the application while they're gone and whatever. They want to have the whole thing ticketed. With an orchestrated layer, we're able to do that. So, and very easily and very quickly. I mean, the whole development time cycle took about 2 weeks to put into place. So it's like unfortunately, it's making us not need it as much. So I'm trying to make us more needed more often because the orchestration stuff just takes so much time away from all these crazy like problems that people are having on the identity side.
I mean, it's awesome. Like both y'all, it's got to be a little bit of a mad scientist thing, isn't it? Where you get to say like, all right, what are we going to do with this thing next? Like we've got this amazing creation and now what to do with it. And so I think, as we talked about this, and there it is.
Wizard, huh?
Yes. I was going to say, props for us today. Well, what I would like to do is, as we're sort of drawing this to a close, we talked about the reason that we wanted to relook at the way that the architecture of your environment today, why an orchestrator is so important to it. And we talked about, where this, the orchestrator from a perspective of comparing, the differences between say DaVinci and Mavericks, where the extensibility and all the power that you get out of Mavericks, why that is just a platform of choice. And then some of these use cases. I'd love to bring this to a close by simply, I put our LinkedIn info up here. Mine means nothing because again, I'm the marketing guy, but I'd love to, if the two of you are cool with it, for the audience, if anyone wants like the anti-sales workshop session, I mean, Granville, you'll even wear the hat maybe. All right. But like, let's say architect to architect, I would love to have that open invite. If you guys are cool with that, have people reach out to you via LinkedIn and have one of those conversations.
Yeah, we do work with clients all the time with, Strata and others where we'll go in and help set up a whole proof of concept in their dev environment. And we'll do a whole dog and pony show before we even bring a salesperson in, right? Let's just engineer to engineer. Let's see if we can do it. Let's see if it's what you want. If it is, awesome. Now go ahead and do all your fun stuff. We'll sit back and let you guys figure it out.
I'll absolutely wear the hat. And I love to nerd out. So if you're just down to nerd out without being sold anything, please reach out.
Sweet. Well, the wormhole. How do I get from point A to point B? You're going to fold the paper in half. You're going to poke a hole through it. You're going to show them an orchestrator. And yes, hopefully our audience enjoyed the time today. Adam, thanks so much for joining Granville and I. It's always great to have you on and join us. And to our audience, it was great having you spend your time with us as well. Take a look one last time, LinkedIn, reach out for the anti-sales workshop to you guys, and appreciate everyone joining us today. Thanks so much.
And also check out my podcast, Nyedis, IAM. It's everywhere, all identity, all access. We talk a lot about orchestration and Strata and all the other tools that are out there. Definitely check it out.
Plug it. That's
Nyedis
it.
Anarchy series. Later.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Nyedis has just created the first iOS app made exclusively for identity management professionals. It's called Nyedis Breachcast, and you can download it now. It's amazing. We have real-time updates of all the latest breaches that are occurring, CVEs as they come out real-time, really pertaining just to identity management. We have media that's going on this podcast. We're going to be bringing in a lot more others as well. And we even have a complete vendor list of all the identity management vendors and all their products, so you can find out exactly where to download their software, all the documentation. And what's even more awesome is an identity management glossary. All those crazy words and acronyms that we can never remember, they're all listed in there for you. No ads, just pure information to make your life simple.